Reg is going to be our next speaker, and at short notice he's prepared quite a nice talk for us. We've gone through it and had a talk about it. And Reg, if you'd like to come forward, as I'm just having a word to say here. Where has he got to? There he is. Reg wanted me to say, and I'm sure you'll pick it up on the way through, that this is not his story. Reg wrote an article for an aviation historical magazine some years ago covering the loss of the 4 Catalinas off the coast of Western Australia. And since I'd read that article and remembered it, I thought it'd be a good thing to get Reg on his feet. So here he is. He's going to be telling someone else's story about the Catalinas. Over to you, Reg.
While you're looking at the windshield, their registrations are 854 something or other, and my Air Force number was 85428, and I always wanted to buy that windshield. Unfortunately, it's over in Wagga. It's been a instructional airframe for years. I don't think it'll ever fly, but it's got my RAF number on. It's amazing what comes out with these blokes with these stories. Well, Rob Turner's famous for having taken a Cessna 152 up over the top of Jandakot and done 70, it's either 72 or 79 turns of a spin, non-stop. And he was videoed all the way down to prove it. So that's Rob up there, the previous speaker. Rob talking about Africa. I only know one little bit about Africa. That was Patrice Lumumba, who I believe was fairly democratically elected president of whichever country it was. And the opposition didn't like him, and he was captured, shanghaied, transported, whatever. And he was flown in an aeroplane to an outback airstrip. And he was flown by an ex-MMA DC-3 captain, Jack Dixon, who'd also flown Lancaster during the war, I believe. And Jack was a freelance. He left MMA, sick of the northwest and sleeping on the veranda at the Port Edlin Esplanade. So he went to Africa, which probably worse over there. And he said, we landed the aeroplane, we opened the back door, and Lumumba was in chains. They said, they backed the truck up. They pushed him off onto the truck and drove off down the road. He said, it only went about 500 yards. And all they heard was bang, 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 bang. He said, I thought it was time to leave. He shut the door and took off, went somewhere else. So that's how they got rid of Lumumba. None of that's anything to do with him. This is all about the Catalinas. And over the years, we've all heard the stories of what happened to the Qantas cats, which covered themselves with glory, flying the double sunrise route between Perth and Ceylon, keeping the Empire Air Route open to the mother country in the dark days of the Japanese onslaught on Southeast Asia and Australia. And the magical dedication to the job by the crews who made it. I've also heard all about the theories about where their sea graves actually are, these Catalinas, and how to go about retrieving one, at least one, to put on display to commemorate the operations. Well, here finally are the facts, faithfully recorded by a West Australian who was there, who actually did the job and describes in detail why you won't ever see them again. Arthur Jones lived in Harvey back in 2004 when I contacted him. I don't know where he is now. He was 80 then, so he's getting to be an old fella. I'd like that. Arthur has kindly allowed us to be there as he recalls the duties the group were ordered to carry out. Back in 2004, I was handed an account of his doings by somebody else, and they thought it'd be interesting for the Civil Aviation Historical Society, of which I was the editor. I talked to him, and he was as bright as a button, very friendly, happy fellow. The copy was pretty poor. It was photocopied, and photocopied probably about 10th copy from his original recording, and ineligible in places. So I rang him and had a long talk to him and mentioned about wanting to put it in the Civil Aviation newsletter and also send it to the Australian Historical Society. He was quite agreeable, and he sent me a better copy with photos of the Catalinas and one of them of himself. They were pretty poor copies also, so he agreed to send me the originals for copy and return. Reading the new copy, some of the sinking dates didn't make sense, some dates were repeated, so I rang him again and he got out his logbook. And what marvellous things logbooks really are. Just imagine, you can't imagine what you can pick up from an old logbook by an odd remote. And he read out all the relevant dates, which I then cleared up in the text. And the final text is as follows. Please note that most of the photos in this PowerPoint display have been provided and collated by a very talented Brian Herman, and some are more from Jeff Goodall's publication Indian Ocean Service 1943-1946. Jeff was a well-respected air traffic controller in Perth back in the good old DCA days. And I am now reading from Arthur's text, well almost. I just want to explain that there's a lot of these photos, I couldn't get them all in date order because it just didn't fit the text, and there are also none of the actual sinkings. So Brian and I have done the best we can with what we've got. So, quote, this transcript was recorded by ex-RAF Sergeant Arthur William Jones, number 81627, on the 5th of January 1986. I was serving in number 43 Squadron, which was based at Rathmines, New South Wales on Lake Macquarie, as a fitter air gunner and a member of the Catalina crew. On about the 3rd of the 1st, I was up in the sergeant's mess at Rathmines, and the orderly officer came in and asked if there were any West Australians in the mess. My thought was, don't ever volunteer for anything, which all servicemen knew. We all thought it was unusual for them to ask if there were WA personnel there, so I thought, what the heck, and I said, yes, I'm a West Aussie and I'm a fitter air gunner. My mate Johnny Evans, who was a flight engineer, was with me, and as there were no other West Australian people there, he said he was available for whatever was going. The orderly officer said, okay, report to orderly room tomorrow morning. So we duly fronted up and they said, you two can have the job, along with pilots Flight Lieutenant Hodson and Whittle in Western Australia. None of us had been home for a long time, so we were delighted and said, what's the job? We were told it was a top secret job and they could not tell us at that stage, but would be told when we got to Perth. We asked if we would be coming back to Rathmines after the job was done, and told we would be. Anyway, on the 6th of January we flew on a Catalina to Rose Bay in Sydney, and then by transport plane VHCIQ Sydney to Melbourne, and on the 7th Melbourne to Parafield, Ceduna to Forest to Kalgoorlie, Kalgoorlie to Perth, and we arrived in Perth on the evening of the 7th. A lot of this you've got to read for yourself because I can't see it from here. Next day we had to report to Air Force House in St George's Terrace, which was headquarters for administration of RAF personnel. We were then duly advised that the job was to dispose of 4 Catalina aircraft that had been flown by Qantas staff from Perth to Ceylon during the war and were based at Crawley. Under the terms of the United States land lease, if the Australian government wanted them, they would have to pay £80,000 each for them, pounds sterling in those days. Anyway, that was our secret mission. But the day before we arrived, there was a report in the West Australian newspaper telling all and sundry what our secret mission was. Typical. So the first thing that had to be done was that these planes had to be checked to see if they were airworthy and that all were in good condition. Why they had to be in good condition, I don't know. They had been locked up for a time and it seemed unsure as to how long since they were flown. As far as I can remember, they were up on shore. The facilities had been into the Catalina to enable temporary wheels to be fitted to bring them out of the water and onto the land. So Johnny Evans and myself went down to Crawley and they had all been stored in the correct manner for storage out of the water. So we got the motors going on the first one without much trouble. All these Catalinas had names after stars, and they were Antares, Rigel, Vega, and Altair, all Southern Hemisphere astro-nav stars. The fifth Catalina, Spica, was not involved in this operation. We checked holes and everything visibly to see if we thought they were okay. So a decision was made. Okay, Antares is ready for takeoff. We all got down to Crawley on 16th of January, this is 1946, at 10:30 hours, and we took off and did a 2-hour test flight. Ted Withell was the skipper and Ted Hodson was the second pilot. We were told that a RAF crash boat had gone out to Rottnest Island the previous evening, and we were to liaise with them as to the condition of the water, winds, etc., and if they thought we could land. So the next morning, 17th, back to Crawley. Also, there was a Royal Air Force flight officer came with us, and he was there to see that nothing was taken from the aircraft, as that would break the Lend-Lease agreement. And being RAF, he would not have a way for one little bit. We couldn't pinch any souvenirs. The key man for the whole exercise was a Navy demolition expert by the name of Peter Vlaming. He came with us and we set off for Rottnest. After getting the weather conditions for the area from the RAF crash boat and checking ourselves, we decided it was okay to land Antares. This was about 13 miles west of Rottnest. We landed and the dinghy from the crash boat came alongside the Catalina and we all transferred to it. The night before, the explosives had been put aboard the crash boat. This consisted of 2 charges, each of about 75 pounds of explosive. One was to be placed in the bow and one in the blister, then connected together. Peter Plowman then loaded the explosives on board the dinghy and rowed to the Catalina. He said there was no danger until these charges were connected. If I'm shouting, it's because of that aeroplane out there. He duly unloaded them from the dinghy, tied up at the blister, and then disappeared into the Catalina, which was riding the swell and drifting with the wind. This exercise was to have the first one up in the blister go off, break it in halves, and then at a predetermined time the one in the bow go off and blow the front section into small pieces so that none would be left floating. The dinghy Peter Plowman used was secured by a long rope to help him once the charges had been set. This was duly done and he got into the dinghy, grabbed the oars and rowed like hell, with us still also towing with the rope back to the crash boat. He jumped on board, we tied the dinghy to the crash boat, went like blazes and stood off about a half a mile from the Catalina. Peter was shaking a bit and he admitted it was a scary sort of a job. "Never mind, Pete," we said. "1 down and 3 to go." "You blokes are a bloody lot of help," was his reply. Anyway, the rear charge went off first, broke the Catalina in halves, and then the front charge went off, and he said, "Good, it worked." We stayed around to make sure that it all sank, so that there would be no shipping hazards. Then the crash boat with all aboard set off back to Fremantle, up the Swan River to Crawley, and the first Catalina was sunk. I've got a picture here of the RAF ground staff, and if I personally can break in here as a general rule, it took 10 men to keep 1 pilot in the air. And that was a fact that as an LOC armourer in my time in the RAF from 1944 to 49, I later well remembered as an airline captain. In this photo there are 19 airmen, properly of these. If you look hard you'll see one's got his arms folded, should be on a charge, and 2 officers. Back to the story. Johnny Evans, the engineer, stayed at my place, number 1 Arlington Street, South Perth, which was my parents' house. After a time he moved to the YMCA in Murray Street, so he was in the city and was able to see more of it. While we were in Perth, apart from our normal Air Force pay, we were receiving a capital city allowance of 16 shillings a day, So we were right up there in the tourist class. You've got a tourist class in brackets. As the three West Australians hadn't been home for some time, we did our best to stretch the job out as long as possible. After the sinking of Antares, it was 12 days to the 29th of January that we flew in Rigel. The inspection of these Catalinas was a long job, and Johnny Evans and myself were the only two people who could say, yes, we can fly in these. So this is probably why we stretched it out a bit, as I mentioned previously. Or 16 shillings a day. So on the 29th, we took off and did a 2-hour test flight on it. Our takeoff was over Kenny Bridge, and sometimes we used to wonder whether we were going to clear it or not. And I'm sure Ted Whittle and Ted Hodgson did not think so, as they were very experienced pilots. Once again, a little interruption for myself. I was training to be a fitter armourer down at 5 STT down on Mounts Bay Road, where the bus station now is, in December 44. And at the end of the working day, we would sit down on the riverside end of our huts in the cool and watch the Catalinas, RAF, Qantas and US take off right over the top of us, flying so low over us that you could see the rivets in the hull with the water still dripping off their keels, and I can still remember that. Back to our historian. On the 30th we did another test flight of 2 hours. Sometimes we would fly north along the coast and sometimes south. So in all we had a pretty good tourist view of our West Australian coast. I may mention that each day the RAF crash boat would go out to Rottnest and stay overnight. On board. On board. We would go down to Crawley each morning, get in radio contact with the boat. They would give us an indication whether they thought we could land or not. Then there was a break of 4 days until the 4th of February when we took off in Rigel and headed out to Rottnest. The weather looked okay, so we set Rigel down, and Peter Plowman and all the crew went through the same procedure again. That's one, a typical RAF hut, I remember. You do everything there, you slept there, there were meals there, whatever, everything went on that type of hut. About 20 men, 10 each side of the hut. We went out to Rottnest, went out the same procedure. This was 18 miles west, 18, 13 west of Rottnest. The rear charge went off as scheduled, but the front one did not go off. We all thought, what are we going to do now? None of us could understand why a Navy boat wasn't used to blow it up, but that was apparently our bureaucratic procedures in those days. Anyway, the sergeant on the crash boat said, no worry fellas, we'll fix it. So out came 3 303 rifles with about 500 rounds of ammunition, and we stood off at a safe distance and started firing. It seems almost impossible that we could put about 200 rounds into Rigel and nothing happened. Anyway, one shot eventually set the front part on fire. It blazed and finally all sank. So that was exercise number 2 completed. It was not until the 13th that we took the next Catalina out on a test flight of 2 hours. I may add that as these Catalinas had not been flown in a fair while, the state of the hulls was an unknown quantity, but as we had landed on the Swan River after each test flight, then another inspection, we were fairly certain that it would stand up to a rough water land in the open sea. On the 14th, we took off at 1200 hours and flew Vega out to 13 miles off Rottnest, where the crash boat was waiting. We duly landed, went through the same procedure, and the exercise was completed. When that was done, we said to Peter Plowman, the Navy man, what's all those grey hairs doing there, Peter? His answer was not fit for recording for future generations to listen to. Anyway, there was another 10 days before we test flew Altair on the 24th of February. I do recall that we had a fair spell of bad weather about that time. Also, the extra spending money was nice. But it looks like one of them, the aeroplane behind there is probably having an engine change, and the engines, I'm talking now, the engines were all sent up to 4 ARD at Kalgoorlie Aircraft Repair Depot, for overhaul and repair. Little memento going back to the Aero Club days at Maylands in the 50s. We had a very nice old Scotch lady who'd been a fitter 2E at Kalgoorlie, and she used to work on these engines and send them out with the rest of them, and she ended up stores lady with the Royal Aero Club of WA in the early 50s. So on the 12th we flew out to Rottnest where the crash boat was waiting. We duly landed, went through the same procedure, and the exercise was complete. On that date we did another test flight, but sadly Ted Whitnell developed malaria and could not fly, so another skipper by the name of Bill Swan, who was a flight lieutenant, took over from Ted Whittle. We did our 2 hours test flight and then back to Crawley. Then it was not until the 27th that we took off in Altair again. We flew 13 miles west of Rottnest and met the crash boat out there, decided the water was okay and landed. Peter Plowman went through the same period procedure once again and set the 2 charges. The back one went off, then the front one, but this time the charge blew off the end of the wing with the wing float attached. All the rest went down, but this piece floated and of course would have been a hazard to shipping, so it had to be sunk. After a big conference with all members, it was duly decided that Arthur Jones and Johnny Evans would go out in the dinghy and sink it. Now this of course was a very technical matter. The dinghy had the rope attached and secured to the crash boat, and we clambered and half fell into the dinghy, me armed with the secret weapon and Johnny on the oars. I may add there was a fairly long swell of about 4 feet running, and it was some time before all hands on the boat and dinghy got us to the floating piece. You can imagine all the advice that was being thrown around as to what we should do and should not do. It was a hairy sort of a job, as the floating piece was coming up as we were going down, like the old saying, up and down like a fiddler's elbow. Anyway, out comes the secret weapon, the tomahawk from the crash boat equipment. I had the tomahawk and I said to Johnny, you hang on to me and I'll chop holes in the float and wing. Let the water in, and that's that. After a number of chops, I made one hell of a swipe at the axe, and the axe got jammed in the float. Johnny yelled out, let go, let it go. And the voice from the sergeant of the crash boat yelled out, don't let it go, I have to account for that. Anyway, the float was starting to sink, so I duly let the axe go, and down the float, and the axe went with it. A small loss after 4 times 80,000 pounds was sunk off Rottnest. So a watery grave for those proud Catalina. And he adds again, I may add a few points of interest. The crash boat used to overnight at Rottnest. The local crayfishermen used to lay cray pots around the island, and somehow or other, on the first couple of trips, we were all treated to a very nice meal of fresh crayfish cooked in the galley of the crash boat. The fishermen had a good idea where their cray pots were and why their cray pots were empty. The sergeant got a blast from headquarters, and of course it could not be proved. He said, no way, we wouldn't do anything like that. But that was the end of the nice crayfish meal. Anyway, we finished the job on the 27th of February, and then we think that the powers that be forgot all about us until suddenly we got frantic messages to report to the Air Force House in St George's Terrace on the 6th of March, and there was a flight arranged for us back to Sydney. We took off from Perth at 1800 hours on board a RAF Transport Command Liberator to Sydney, and it was a 9-hour direct flight. The skipper's name was Flying Officer Horn, and then on the 8th we got a flight from Rose Bay in Sydney back to Rathmines, piloted by Squadron Leader Gray on Catalina A2410. And in closing, this is still Arthur. In closing, as a matter of interest, the flights from Crawley to Ceylon, which these Qantas Catalinas did, were known as the double sunrise flights. They took off St Daylight on Tuesday morning and flew all that day and night and landed in Ceylon the next morning at sunrise. The flight time was about 31 to 32 hours, hence the name double sunrise flights. These Catalinas were under strict radio silent security from any radar or radio contact, and all the nav was done by dead reckoning. So that was a mighty achievement on its own. Also, if medals were handed out then, as they are today, Lieutenant Peter Plowman, Navy demolition expert, should have been awarded the highest valour medal available in the service, because it was a bloody hairy job. Still, Arthur, this information was requested by Eric Carpenter, Secretary of our Catalina Association, so it could be put into records for future generations. Okay, that is all. This is Ex-Sergeant Arthur Jones, fitter air gunner, originally member of 11 and 43 squadrons and a member of Ron Black's crew for quite a long time. Signing off, unquote, from Arthur. There are at least 3 of these memorial plaques down the Matilda Bay area, spotted around here and there, and that's one provided by Brian, and he's highlighted part of the list of names, and some there that you can recognise, or I can recognise that I know of as Digby Bull, Phil Hicks, I think it's John Lawton, I'm not sure, Doug Muir, whose house we now live in, and Ivan Pearce, who was a member of the Retired Pilots Association for a long time. There was another close-up of the main plaque on the stone, and this one was installed by the Catalina Association at a big reunion they had here in 1994. Vega, which was mentioned earlier, was not sunk off Rottnest, but was scuttled off Sydney. This is a typical Catalina touchdown. It's supposed to be a lasty pretty well, and if you get a look at the elevators, you can see how high the elevators are. So it's got to be landing. It always reminded me of the instructor's loud cry when we were landing Flying Tigers. I can see Sid up there, who was one, and Jack Murray. They'd all be yelling out, stick back, back in the guts, till you touch down. The only way to land a tail wheel. As a matter of interest, from 1941 through 1945, American industry delivered more than 276,000 military aircraft. The number of Catalinas built was 4,051, and the unit cost in 1935 US dollars was 90,000. This is one of my models from my collection. It's solid brass, made by the fitters, who used to call them foreigners. They made them when they had nothing to do. It's got a wingspan of 17 inches, 43 centimetres, and it weighs 7 kilos, a fair bit of equipment. The order of the double sunrise was termed because the flights left before dawn, and the sun came up twice during the trip, hence the certificate handed to passengers who endured the trip. Also, it's been said that due to the very high fuel overload, single engine safety speed was attained 7 to 8 hours after takeoff. When the Catalina that has been recently installed at the Aviation Heritage Museum at Bull Creek was dedicated some little while ago, Ivan Pearce, who was a first officer on many of the flights and post-war flew with TAA, and in retirement a tireless worker for the project, came out to the museum to see the finished result. Ivan, who incidentally sadly took off with a big hanger in the sky a little while ago, was of short stature, and standing under the wing, gazing up at his old mount, he finally opined, "They weren't this big when we flew them." Thank you.